The summer the drought broke McDowell County. There was one green thing left standing on Bear Creek Branch, and it was growing out of stone. Cardin Sexton stood at the fence line with his hat in his hands, looking at 40 acres of clover thick enough to hide a dog, and he didn't say a word. 3 years before that, he'd told half the county that ground wouldn't grow a weed. But to understand how a woman with a dead man's notebook and a piece of land nobody wanted turned into the only green thing left in the valley, you have to go back 8 years, to a cold morning in the McDowell County courthouse, when Bertie Mullins was still young enough to be called somebody's daughter and old enough to already know what it felt like to bury one. It was the summer of 1991, and the courthouse in Welch smelled like floor wax and old paper, the kind of smell that gets into your clothes and stays there the rest of the day. Bertie sat on a hard wooden bench outside the clerk's office with her hands folded in her lap, waiting on the reading of her father's will. Arlie Mullins had died in the spring, quiet in his sleep the way he'd lived, and he hadn't left much, a house that leaned a little to the east, a mule too old to plow straight, and 40 acres up on the ridge above Bear Creek Branch that everybody in 3 townships called, plainly and without malice, the Rocky Ridge. The lawyer read it out flat, the way lawyers do, like he was reading a grocery list instead of a man's whole life boiled down to paper. The house and the flat bottomland went to Bertie's older brother, who'd already loaded half his truck before the ink was dry. The mule went to a cousin who needed it more, and the Rocky Ridge, 40 acres of shale and quartz and stubborn red clay, tilted so steep in places a man had to plant sideways just to keep his seed from rolling to the county road, went to Bertie, along with her father's old canvas cover field notebook, tied shut with a leather bootlace, because nobody else in the family wanted either one. She could still remember walking out of that courthouse into the flat grey light of a July morning, the notebook tucked under her arm like it might get away from her, and hearing her brother laugh behind her, not cruel, just tired and a little embarrassed for her. "Papa gave you the rock pile, Bertie," he said. "Guess he figured you'd need something to keep you busy." She didn't answer him. She never did answer people who laughed at her, not that day and not for years after. She just held the notebook a little tighter and walked to where her husband Dewey was waiting with the truck, and she didn't cry until she was 3 miles down the road with the window rolled up so he wouldn't hear her over the engine. That's the first thing you have to understand about Bertie Mullins. She never argued with a doubter. She just went quiet and she went to work. And that's the second loop this story is going to leave hanging in the air for you a good while yet. What in that dead man's notebook made a woman with a bad hip and a husband who didn't believe in it either decide that stone ground was worth saving? Because Dewey didn't believe in it. Not at first. He was a good man, big through the shoulders, gentle with animals and rough with machinery, and he loved his wife plainly and without much talk about it. But he stood at the edge of that ridge with her the week after the funeral, looking down at ground so thin you could see the bones of the mountain poking through it in 3 places, and he said what everybody else in the valley was thinking. "Bertie, honey, there's nothing up here but what killed your daddy's back for 40 years. Let's sell it to Estill Gentry and be done." Estill Gentry had already come around twice by then, a soft-spoken man in a clean shirt who bought up worthless corners of land all over McDowell County for next to nothing and held on to them for reasons nobody quite understood, waiting maybe on a coal lease or right-of-way or just the slow appreciation of anything that touched a road. He'd offered Bertie $1,100 for the whole 40 acres, cash money, no questions, and told her with a kind of gentle pity that she was doing herself a favor taking it. $1,100 was not nothing to a young couple in 1991, and Dewey had looked at her that night at the kitchen table, like he half expected her to say yes. She didn't say yes. She didn't say much of anything for 3 days. She just sat up at the kitchen table after Dewey had gone to bed, working the bootlace loose off her father's notebook by lamplight, and started to read. What was in that notebook is the thing that's going to matter most before this story is through, and I'm not going to tell you all of it yet, because Bertie herself didn't understand all of it that first night either. What she found was pages and pages in her father's crooked hand, dates, weather, the color of the dirt after rain, little sketches of where the water ran off the ridge in a storm and where it pooled, notes on a patch up near the north fence line, that he'd worked different from the rest, going back to some year in the 1950s, scratched at the top of the page. Words she didn't fully understand yet, words like sweet clover and sour ground and give it back what you take. A man who had walked that same worthless ridge for 40 years, not to farm it the way everybody farmed the bottomland, but to watch it. The way you'd watch a sick animal you were trying to understand before you tried to cure. She didn't tell Dewey what she'd decided until the morning she walked out to the barn and started loading 50-pound sacks of coarse rock salt and a burlap sack of clover seed into the bed of the truck. He stood in the barn door in his undershirt, coffee going cold in his hand, and asked her plain what in God's name she thought she was doing. Testing something Daddy started, she said, and that was all the explanation he got that morning, and it was near about all the explanation anybody in the valley ever got out of her for the next 8 years. Word got around fast in a place like Bear Creek Branch the way it does. By the following Saturday, when Bertie and Dewey drove into Welch for the county feed store and the little gathering that passed for a farmer's market on the courthouse square, half the men standing around the tailgates already knew. Cardin Sexton was there, same as always, a big confident man of 38 who worked 70 acres of the best bottomland on the branch and never let anybody forget it. He had a way of talking that made a joke sound like kindness, which was worse somehow than if he'd just been cruel about it outright. "Heard you're planting clover on the rock pile, Bertie," he said, loud enough for the men around him to hear, grinning under his hat. "Might as well plant it on the courthouse steps, same amount of dirt to work with." A few men laughed, not unkindly, just the easy laugh of people who agreed with him and didn't mind saying so. Somebody else added that Bertie Mullins himself had never gotten a lick of yield off that ground in 40 years of trying. God rest him, and if he couldn't do it, nobody could. Bertie stood by the truck bed with a 50-pound sack of clover seed still balanced against her hip, and she said, "Thank you kindly for the concern, Cardin," in a voice as even and pleasant as if he'd complimented her garden. And she went right on, loading feed into the truck like the conversation had already ended, because as far as she was concerned, it had. That silence of hers unsettled people more than an argument would have. Dewey noticed it too. Driving home that evening, the truck rattling over the gravel with the windows down and the smell of cut hay coming off somebody's field. "You don't ever fight back," he said. "Not quite a question." "Nothing to fight," she said. "They'll either see it or they won't." But that night, alone at the kitchen table after Dewey had gone up to bed, she opened the notebook again to the page dated late in the spring some 30-odd years back, and read the line her father had underlined twice in pencil so hard it had nearly torn through the paper. "Stone don't refuse a seed, it refuses a hurry." She sat with that a long while, turning the words over the way you'd turn a stone over in your hand, looking for the flat side, and she still didn't understand exactly what he'd meant. But she understood enough to know it was the whole reason he'd left her that ridge, and not the bottomland, and enough to know that whatever answer was waiting up there in that thin red clay, it wasn't going to come to her quick, and it wasn't going to come to her the way anybody else in the valley expected. Outside, the July night sat close and warm over Bear Creek Branch, crickets going steady in the grass, and somewhere up on the ridge in the dark, 40 acres of stone waited on her the way they'd waited on her father before her, patient as the mountain itself, giving up nothing to anybody in a hurry. She started the next morning, before the dew had burned off, carrying a coffee can of clover seed up the switchback trail in one hand, and her father's notebook tucked against her ribs with the other, and she spent the better part of that first week just walking the ridge the way you'd walk a room in the dark, learning it by touch. She found the seams where the sandstone broke into shelves, and the pockets where a thin skin of red clay had gathered over God knew how many winters, no deeper than the length of her thumb in most places. She found where water moved after a hard rain, a dry vein of a gully that cut down through the rock like something had once been alive there and left its track behind. Her father had drawn that gully on a page dated 19 years back, a single crooked line with an arrow at the bottom, and beside it he'd written only follows the same road every time. Plant behind it, not in it. So she planted behind it. She worked clover seed into the clay pockets with her bare fingers, pressing each pinch down and covering it with a scrap of leaf litter she hauled up in a feed sack, and by the time Dewey came looking for her at supper time, her knees were raw through her stockings, and her hands were the color of the ridge itself, red-brown to the wrist. He didn't ask her what she was doing. He'd stopped asking by the third day. He just handed her a jar of water and sat down on a flat rock beside her and watched the light go long and gold over Bear Creek Branch. And after a while he said, "Your daddy ever tell you why he wanted this piece over the bottom land?" "No," she said. "Just that I'd know when I knew. That's a hell of a thing to leave a person." "It's what he had," she said. And that was true enough that Dewey let it lie. The clover came up thin and pale within 3 weeks, threading up out of the clay pockets in scraggly little runners that a stiff wind looked like it could kill. And for a while Bertie let herself believe that was simply how it was supposed to look on ground this poor a slow green that would thicken with time, the way her father's notebook seemed to promise, patient as the mountain itself. But the dry spell that came through in late July had other ideas. It sat over McDowell County for 11 days without a drop, the kind of dry that turned the garden dust and made the well pump groan on the upstroke. And when Bertie climbed the ridge on the 12th morning to check on her clover, she found most of it gone brown and brittle, curled up on itself like something that had died trying to say a word. She stood there a long moment, with her hand pressed flat against a warm shelf of rock, not crying, because crying wasn't a thing she did standing up in daylight where the whole holler could see the dust on her knees, but feeling something in her chest go tight and small all the same. She'd put near every dollar she and Dewey had put back that spring into that seed and into a used hand tiller Bertie Mullins had left behind in the tool shed, its tines rusted stiff, that she'd spent 2 Sundays freeing up with penetrating oil and a wire brush. $41 in seed, $6 for the oil, and a new tiller belt. It didn't sound like much money to a man like Cardin Sexton, who ran 70 head of cattle on bottomland that never asked him twice for anything, but it was near everything Bertie had, and now half of it lay curled and dead in the clay. That was the week Estill Gentry's truck came up the county road for the first time, dust boiling behind it, and stopped at the foot of her drive, with a door that squeaked when it opened, the kind of sound a man let happen on purpose, because it announced him before he had to speak. He was a heavy-set man with a soft handshake and a way of looking at land like he was already pricing the timber on it, and he stood at Bertie's gate, turning his hat in his hands, and told her, kindly enough, that he represented some interests looking to consolidate acreage up along the Bear Creek branch ridgeline. Nothing final, just conversation, and that he could offer her a fair number for the rocky piece her daddy had left her. More than fair, really, considering what it's worth to anybody else, he said, and smiled like he'd been generous. She told him she'd think on it, which was the polite way of saying no in that part of the county. And she watched his truck pull back down the road, trailing dust the color of the ridge itself, and she went inside and sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of her and didn't write anything down, just looked at her father's handwriting until the light changed. It was Dewey who found her there. He read the numbers she hadn't spoken out loud off her face the way he read weather off the sky, and he didn't tell her to sell, and he didn't tell her not to, which was its own kind of faith in her. She didn't have the words to thank him for. What he did was go out to the shed the next morning before work and come back with 2 more feed sacks of leaf litter and a jar of water gone warm from sitting on the truck seat, and he carried them up the ridge himself and set them down next to where she was already kneeling in the clay, and he said, "Show me where the gully runs." And she did, and for the rest of that dry spell, evenings after his shift at the tipple, he hauled water up that switchback trail 1 jar at a time and poured it, not on the dead clover, but on the green that had survived, the runners that had rooted deepest into the shaded pockets behind the gully line, because that was what the notebook said to save. Some of it held. Not all of it. She lost close to half that first stand before August rain finally broke the dry spell. But the runners in the deep pockets came back greener than before, like the drought had done something to sort the ridge's mind for her, showing her exactly which 6 or 8 spots out of 40 acres actually meant to hold a plant. She wrote that down in a fresh notebook she'd started keeping alongside her father's, a 5-cent composition book from the feed store, because if this was going to work at all, it wasn't going to be by accident, and she wasn't going to trust it to memory the way some folks trusted their whole lives to. At the feed store that same week, Cardin Sexton was telling anybody who'd stand still long enough that he'd heard Estill Gentry had been up Bertie Mullins's road, and that if Estill Gentry was sniffing around a piece of ground, it generally meant one of 2 things. Either there was coal under it worth the trouble, in which case good luck to her getting a fair shake from a man like that, or the fellow had simply heard, same as everybody else in the county, that the widow up on the ridge was digging in dirt that wasn't going to give her a nickel's worth of anything, and was fixing to buy it for pennies once she gave up trying. Wouldn't blame her for taking it, Cardin said loud enough to carry to the back of the store where 2 men were splitting a sack of chicken feed. Man offers you real money for dead ground, only a fool turns her nose up at it. Word of that got back to Bertie the way word always did in a place where everybody's business rode the same 3 roads, and it put a small cold stone in her stomach that she carried around for the better part of a day, because there was a version of Cardin's logic that made a certain kind of sense, the kind of sense that kept a person up at 2 in the morning doing arithmetic in the dark. $41 gone half to nothing, a tiller with a belt that had already snapped once, a ridge that had just shown her, in plain terms, exactly how much of itself it was willing to give up without a fight, and a man in a truck offering cash money for the whole troublesome business, enough to cover what she and Dewey had put in, and then some, enough that nobody could rightly call her foolish for taking it. She lay awake that night, listening to Dewey breathe evenly beside her, and turned the question over the way her father had told her to turn over a stone, looking for the flat side. What if they're right, she thought. Plain as that. No dressing on it. What if Daddy left me this ground not because he knew something, but because it was the only piece nobody else in the family wanted, and he didn't have the heart to tell me there wasn't a lesson in it? Just poor rock and a man's guilt for not having more to leave. It was the ugliest thought she'd let herself have since he died, and she made herself sit with it instead of pushing it away, because pushing it away felt like a kind of lying, and lying to herself was a thing she didn't do even in the dark. But somewhere past midnight, she got up anyway, quiet so as not to wake Dewey, and lit the lamp at the kitchen table and opened her father's notebook again to the page with the underlined line. Stone don't refuse a seed, it refuses a hurry, and beneath it, in ink gone brown with age, a second line she hadn't paid proper mind to before. Smaller, almost an afterthought. Ask what held on when the rest gave out. That's your ground talking back to you. And she thought about the runners behind the gully, the ones that had come back greener after the drought instead of dying with the rest, and she understood, not all at once, but like a lamp catching, that her father hadn't left her a guess. He'd left her a question, and the ridge itself had just answered the first part of it in the plainest language there was, not with what grew easy, but with what refused to quit. She didn't sell. She didn't even drive down to tell Estelle Gentry no in person. She simply didn't answer when his truck came up the road a second time in September, and after a while it quit coming altogether. And Cardin Sexton, when he heard she'd turned the offer down flat, laughed out loud at the counter of the feed store and said something about a woman who'd rather starve proud than eat sensible. And two of the men who'd overheard it laughed along with him because that was easier than not laughing. And none of them thought a second time about it, because by then it was October, and the leaves were turning on Bear Creek Branch, and nobody in that valley had any earthly reason yet to believe the driest summer in 9 years was only a rehearsal for the one still to come. Winter came on hard that year, the kind that cracked the pump handle if you forgot to wrap it. And Bertie spent the cold months the way she'd spent every winter since her father died, sitting close to the stove with the notebook open on her knee, reading the same lines over until they stopped being words and started being instructions. Ask what held on when the rest gave out. She thought of the clover runners behind the gully more times than she could count, and by February she'd walked the whole back ridge twice. On days so cold, her breath hung in front of her like smoke, marking with chips of white limestone every place where something green had refused to quit through August's drought and September's frost, both. There were more of those places than she'd expected. 9 of them, scattered across the stone, like a message somebody had written a long time ago and left for her to find one flake at a time. She didn't tell Dewey the whole of it, not because she was hiding anything, but because some things don't turn into truth until you've said them out loud to the dirt first. What she told him was that she wanted to try the whole back ridge in strips this time, not just the 2 acres she'd tested the year before, and that she wanted to do it with clover first, ploughed under come May, and corn planted into the green after. The way her father's notebook seemed to be telling her, if you knew how to read between what he'd written and what he hadn't. Dewey looked at her a long moment over his coffee, and there was a thing in his face that wasn't doubt exactly, more like a man doing arithmetic he already knew the answer to and not liking it. Bertie, he said, we spent near everything we had on salt and seed last spring, and got 2 rows of corn no taller than my boot for it. She didn't argue with the fact of it. She only said that the 2 rows that had come up in the exact spots where the clover runners had held through the dry, and that a fact like that wasn't luck twice. They didn't have the money for 9 strips of clover seed, not close to it, so she sold the good wedding china that had come down from her mother, 6 place settings wrapped in a quilt in the top of the closet since before Dewey ever proposed, and she sold it to a woman 2 hollers over without telling anyone in Welch, because word of that would have given Cardin Sexton something new to say at the feed store, and she'd had enough of what he already said. The china bought 70 pounds of clover seed and a little left over for salt, and in April she and Dewey walked the ridge together, dropping seed into ground that still looked, to anybody driving past on the county road, like nothing but broke stone and old broom sedge. The clover came up thin in some strips and thick in others, and by June, when it should have been knee-high and green enough to plough under, 4 of the 9 strips had all but died back in a dry spell that hit early that year, weeks before anybody expected it. Bertie walked those 4 strips every evening after supper, kneeling down in the cracked ground, working her fingers into the dirt at the roots. And what she found there scared her more than she let show. The clover in those 4 strips wasn't dead, not all the way, but it wasn't thriving either. And she couldn't find the reason in anything her father had written. She sat up 2 nights, running with the notebook and a lamp. And on the second night, close to 2 in the morning, Dewey came out to the kitchen and found her crying. Quiet, the kind of crying a person does when they don't want anybody to hear it, and he didn't say anything. He just sat down across from her and put his hand flat on the table between them, and after a while she put her hand on his. "I don't know if I've been reading it right," she said. "Maybe Cardin's right, and I'm just a woman playing at something her daddy never meant for anybody to take serious." Dewey didn't answer that the way she expected. He didn't tell her she was right, and he didn't tell her she was wrong. He said, "Your daddy walked that ridge for 30 years and never once got it to feed a chicken, and you got 4 strips out of 9 holding on through the worst dry spell since I was a boy. And if that's failure, Bertie, I'd like to see what you call it when it works." Then he went back to bed, and she sat alone a while longer, turning that over, and it didn't fix the 4 dying strips, but it steadied something in her that had been shaking. She went back to the notebook one more time before dawn, past the line about hurry and past the line about what held on, to a page near the back she'd always taken for a grocery list: string, salt, seed corn, and a word she'd never made sense of: ash. Her father had never kept a fireplace of ash worth mentioning, burned mostly coal like everybody in that county. But there was a stand of old chestnut stumps up past the fence line, rotted and half-burned from a fire that had gone through there before Bertie was even born, and it came to her sitting at that table that ash meant something particular in ground this thin and sour, that it would sweeten what the limestone alone couldn't reach. She didn't wait for full light. She was up on the ridge with a burlap sack and a hand rake before the sun cleared Bear Creek, working wood ash from the old burn scar into the soil around the 4 failing strips, not knowing if it would do a single thing, only knowing that a question her father had left her wasn't finished being answered. It took 11 days to know. On the 12th morning, she walked up before Dewey was even awake, and 2 of the 4 strips had greened back at the crown, small, tentative, but unmistakably alive in a way they hadn't been 2 weeks before. The other 2 hadn't moved either direction, neither better nor worse. And she stood there a long while turning that fact over too, because it wasn't the clean answer she'd wanted. It was a half answer, the kind her father seemed to specialize in leaving behind, and she understood then with a kind of tired clarity that whatever this ridge was going to give her, it wasn't going to give it all at once, and it wasn't going to give it for free. By July, the 7 strips that it held were thick enough to plow under, and she and Dewey turned the clover into the soil themselves, walking the mule team up and down ground that had never once in living memory been worked that way. While down at the bottom of the ridge, Cardin Sexton's good, black bottomland corn stood tasseled out and glossy in rows, so straight you could have drawn them with a string. And when he drove past on the county road and saw the Mullinses out there turning green clover under on the rock pile, everybody in Welch still called by that name, he slowed his truck just long enough to lean out the window and holler that Bertie ought to save herself the trouble and just go on and plant confetti. On account of that it'd grow about as good, and he laughed all the way down the hill, and 2 men walking along the fence line laughed with him without hardly thinking about it, because Cardin Sexton, laughing was a thing folks in that valley had learned to go along with. Bertie straightened up from the mule team's traces, wiped her face with her forearm, and didn't answer him at all. She watched his truck go on down toward the bottomland, toward that glossy green corn that the whole county pointed to as proof of what real farming looked like. And something in her, some small stubborn thing that had been living quiet in her chest since her father's funeral, noted plainly that Cardin's corn had never once had to prove anything to anybody. Not yet. Not in a year that hadn't tested it, and she went back to the traces and finished the row. By August, the corn she'd seeded into the turned-under clover was standing green and ragged across 7 strips of stone that had never grown a stalk of anything in anyone's memory, shorter than Cardin's bottomland corn, thinner in the row, nowhere near as pretty to look at from the county road, but standing and drinking rain that fell soft and regular that whole month, the way it always did in a normal August in McDowell County. The kind of rain nobody thought twice about, the kind that falls so easy you forget to be grateful for it, the kind that was already, though not one soul in Bear Creek branch had cause yet to know it. The last easy rain that valley was going to see for the better part of a year. The rain that fell easy in August was the last kindness that Sky handed out, though nobody in Bear Creek branch knew to be grateful for it while it lasted. Bertie didn't know it either, not with her whole chest and her whole mind, but there was a place low down in her, the same place that had watched Cardin's glossy corn and noted it hadn't been tested yet, that kept turning over her father's handwriting at night by lamplight, the way a woman turns over a coin in her pocket without meaning to spend it. Bertie Mullins had written small, cramped letters that leaned hard to the left, like a man in a hurry to get the truth down, before it slipped away from him. Clover turned under in the fall he'd written. Feeds the rock, same as it feeds the bottom, only slower, only truer. Bertie had read that line so many times the page had gone soft at the crease, and some nights she read it out loud to the empty cabin just to hear a voice in the room, even if it was only her own, borrowing her father's words. She had 2 failures behind her by then, and she counted them the way her father had taught her to count a bad crop, not as shame, but as information. The first spring she'd broken ground on the ridge. She'd planted corn straight into stone-cut furrows the way anybody would, and it had come up thin and yellow and given her not quite enough to seed the following year, let alone eat. She had stood over those sorry stalks in September with Dewey still living then, and Dewey had put his hand on the back of her neck, not saying it was foolish, just saying it was hard, and she had let herself cry exactly once, quick and quiet, and then she had gone back to her father's notebook. The second spring, she'd tried the clover alone, no corn at all, just to see would it even take root in ground that broke a plough blade if you weren't careful. And it had taken, thin and patchy, but green, clinging to the cracks between the rocks like it had been invited. She had walked those rows at dusk, touching the leaves with her fingertips, half suspicious of her own hope, because hope on the rocky ridge had cost her before. It was Cardin who gave the ridge that name in the first place, or so the story went around Bear Creek Branch, though nobody could swear to the exact day. Folks said he'd stood at the bottom of it once, years back, and called up to whoever was fool enough to be working it, that they might as well call it the Rocky Ridge and be done pretending it was farmland. The name had stuck the way names do in a small valley, worn smooth by repeating, until even Bertie caught herself saying it without the bitterness she used to feel. Dewey had never called it that. Dewey had called it Bertie's Ground, plain as that, right up until the morning 3 years back when the tractor rolled on the switchback above the lower field and took him out of the world before anybody could reach him. She did not let herself walk that morning over again, not in the daylight anyway, though it came for her sometimes after dark, uninvited, the sound of Arlie's old dog barking wrong. The long minute before she understood why, what she had instead of Dewey was work, and work had never once turned its back on her the way people could. In the third spring, the one that would matter, she took her father's notebook down to the turned clover herself, before first light, kneeling in the wet ground with her knees soaking through her dress, running the soil between her fingers the way Arlie used to, checking for that give, that softness that meant the roots had done something under the surface nobody could see from the road. It had changed. She could feel it change under her hands, dark and crumbling instead of hard and pale, and she sat back on her heels in the grey morning and let herself believe just for a minute before she made herself get up and get to work, because belief didn't plant corn and neither did sitting still. She seeded that third spring with a mule team borrowed from her cousin Ona, since her own mule had gone lame the winter before, and she paid Ona back in canning. Jars of beans and tomatoes lined up on the porch rail like a debt made visible. The seed went into the stone rows a little deeper than the extension man in town would have told her, on account of what her father's notebook said about roots needing to chase the moisture down between the rocks, rather than spreading thin across the top where the sun could rob it away. Cardin drove past twice more that spring, and both times he had something to say, though the second time it was shorter. Just a look out the window and a shake of his head, no holler this time, as if the joke had gotten old, even to him, or as if some small worried part of him had noticed the green climbing higher on that hillside than a joke ought to allow. Bertie noticed him notice. She said nothing. She had learned silence didn't cost her anything, and it kept whatever she was building safe from other people's doubt, kept it hers a little longer. At the county store in June, buying nails and a length of rope, she overheard 2 men from the feed co-op talking about the season, saying the weather had turned strange down south, dry where it ought to be green. And one of them laughed and said maybe the Lord was punishing the flatland for thinking it didn't need rain like everybody else. Bertie paid for her nails and didn't say anything, but she carried that laugh home with her up the hill, turning it over the way she turned over her father's words, wondering, low down where she didn't like to look too closely, what it might mean for ground that had nothing stored up in it the way the rocky ridge now did. She lay awake that night longer than she meant to, listening to the cabin settle, and let herself ask the question straight out for the first time. What if they were right after all, and this was only a good spring doing what good springs do, and come the next dry stretch her clover and her stone rose would show themselves for what everyone said they were, a widow's foolishness dressed up as patience. She did not have an answer. She only had the notebook and the ground under her hands that morning, softer than it had ever been, and she decided, the way her father must have decided 100 times before her, that she would rather be wrong from trying than wrong from giving up, and she turned over and made herself sleep. July came in dry and stayed that way, and by the second week the whole of McDowell County had stopped talking about anything else. The creeks along Bear Creek Branch shrank down to threads of brown water picking their way between stones that hadn't shown themselves in years. Cardin Sexton's bottomland, the good ground he'd always held up as proof of what a man could do with real soil, cracked open in long seams. You could lose a hoe handle in. His corn stood shoulder height, and then simply stopped, the leaves curling in on themselves at midday like hands closing into fists, and by evening they'd straighten out again, just enough to fool a man into hoping, and by the next noon they'd curl tighter than before. He took to walking his rows at dusk with a jar of creek water, pouring a cupful at the base of a stalk here and there, as if that might do anything against a sky that hadn't given up rain in 26 days. Bertie watched the sky same as everyone, but she watched her ridge more. She went up morning and evening both now past the point of needing to check anything in particular, going instead the way a person visits somebody they love who's poorly, just to sit with it and see. The clover held. Not the deep, unbothered green of a wet spring, but a tempered green, a green that had clearly noticed the dry and decided to spend its water carefully, rather than panic, the way her father used to say good rootstock does. Where the trefoil roots ran down into the cracks between the sandstone shelves, the ground beneath stayed dark when she dug a finger in, cool, even at 2 in the afternoon, holding what little the spring had left in it, the way the salt in the fence-line crevices had once held brine for men who needed it to keep. She understood, finally and completely, what her father had been building toward all those years without ever quite explaining it to her outright. The whole ridge had become one long larder, stone and root, working together to keep something in reserve against exactly this kind of summer, the kind that came for everybody sooner or later and found most of them with nothing put by. The talk in Welch turned uglier before it turned humble, the way talk does when men are frightened and looking for someone to be right at. At the feed co-op, Estill Gentry made the rounds buying up options on land from families who saw the writing plain enough. 3 failed weeks of rain and a mortgage note coming due in the fall would break most any farm that hadn't put money by. He came up Bertie's road again on a Tuesday, driving slower this time, no straw showing beneath his hat brim. Dust settled thick on the hood of his car from the dry roads. He found her at the crib splitting kindling, and didn't get out right away, just sat with the window down and looked up the hillside at that band of green running along under the grey stone, like something that oughtn't be there in a summer like this one. Everybody else is drying up, he said finally. You're not? No, Bertie said. I'm not. I'll go higher than before, a good deal higher. Man in Bluefields asking about hill ground now. Wants somewhere his cattle can still find shade and water when the bottoms go. I could get you enough to set yourself up proper somewhere with a well already dug and a house that don't leak. She set the maul down and looked at him a long moment, not unkindly. Mr. Gentry, 3 years ago you told me this ridge wasn't worth the paper the deed was printed on. Man can be wrong. He can, she agreed. I don't want your money. Wasn't looking for it then, and I'm not looking for it now that it's grown some. She picked the maul back up. But I thank you for asking twice. Most men don't own to being wrong even once. He sat another moment, then touched his hat and backed the car down the drive. And she never saw him come up that road again, though she heard later he sold off half his own bottomland options that fall for less than he'd hoped, once word got around about what the drought had actually done and hadn't done. It was the county fair, the 3rd week of August, that settled the matter in front of everybody at once, the way these things sometimes need settling. Bertie hadn't planned to enter anything. She'd never once, in 8 years, put an exhibit in the agricultural hall, not after that first season's laughter had taught her the wisdom of staying quiet about her business. But her jars of dried clover seed, saved back each year the way her father's notebook had instructed, 60 small envelopes of it stored against future plantings, had multiplied past what she needed, and on a whim, walking past the fairgrounds with a sack of them meant for a neighbor down toward Iaga, she'd stopped at the hall entrance and seen the judging table for forage crops standing near empty, only 2 entries on it, both from bottomland farms whose clover stands had burned down to brown stubble in the drought, same as everything else green in the county that year. She set her jar down almost as an afterthought, more out of habit than ambition, and walked on to find her neighbor. She never saw the judges come through. She never saw the ribbon go up. It was Dewey's cousin who found her at the horse barn an hour later, breathless, saying somebody had best come see the forage table, and Bertie walked back through the crowded aisle, already knowing in the pit of her stomach what she'd find, because there is a way word travels through a fairground crowd ahead of the person it concerns, a kind of hush and turn that precedes bad news and good news alike. The blue ribbon sat pinned beside her jar. Beneath it, in the judge's own hand on the card, was written, "Exceptional density and vigor under drought stress. Inquiry welcome." A cluster of people stood around the table, more than she'd have guessed cared one way or the other about clover seed, and among them, near the back, arms still crossed the way they'd been crossed at her 3 years before, stood Cardin Sexton, staring at that jar like it had said something to him personally. He didn't laugh this time. He came forward instead, slow, the way a man walks when he's decided something on his way across a room, and he stopped in front of her with his hat in his hands now instead of on his head, which she noticed because she'd never once seen him take it off in her presence. "That's off the rocky ridge," he said. "Not a question, it is. My bottom's about done for the year. Might not make seed money back even. I heard talk you'd figured something with clover and rock that the rest of us didn't." He turned the hat once in his hands. "I'm asking plain, Bertie, in front of whoever wants to hear it. Would you teach me? I got no pride left to lose on the matter, not this August." There was a stillness around that table that seemed to hold the whole hall in it a moment, the kind of quiet that follows an admission nobody expected to hear, out loud, least of all from the man who'd made it. Bertie felt the old urge rise in her, the tired satisfaction of being owed an apology and finally getting handed one, and she let it pass through her without holding on to it, the way she'd learned to let go of most things that didn't feed the ground or the animals or the work still ahead. "Come by Thursday," she said. "Bring a notebook of your own. I'll show you what I know, and we'll see what your bottom can carry, because it's not the same ground as mine, and won't want the same answer exactly. But there's a start in it for you, if you want it." He nodded, put his hat back on, and that was the whole of it. No long speech, no crowd applauding, just a man who'd been wrong walking off to find seed money for a fall planting of something he'd mocked 3 summers running. She brewed coffee for him that Thursday on the stove her father had cooked on, and they sat on the porch with the notebook open between them. And she walked him through what the pages said in her father's cramped hand. The years of small failures folded into the years that worked, and she told him plain that she'd nearly quit twice herself, that the second season had near broken her, that she'd lain awake more nights than he'd guess, wondering if the whole county wasn't right about her after all. He listened to that part longest, she noticed, longer than he listened to the particulars of trefoil and salt and stone. The valley didn't stop talking about that drought for years afterward, the way valleys don't, but the story changed shape the way stories do once enough seasons have passed over them. It wasn't the widow and her foolish ridge anymore. It was Bertie Mullins who'd read her father's book when nobody else believed there was anything worth reading in it, and who'd kept faith with a piece of ground the whole holler had written off as dead, until the one summer that mattered most proved out every quiet year that came before it. She still walks that hillside most mornings, the notebook long since copied over into a newer one in her own hand now, additions in the margins her father never got to make. The clover still holds the stone the way it always did, green even when the bottoms burn, and if you ask her why she kept at it those first hard years when everyone told her to quit, she'll tell you it wasn't stubbornness, not really. It was that her father had trusted the ground enough to write it all down for somebody who hadn't been born yet, and she figured the least she owed him was the patience to find out if he'd been right. The land keeps a memory, and we tell it. If a woman in your own family ever held onto ground or a notion nobody else believed in, we'd be glad to hear her story in the comments below. These tales find us the same way hers found the world, one person passing it to another. Thank you for sitting with us a while this evening. We'll have another story soon from another hillside about another woman the land never forgot.